Hi, hope you're keeping well. I'm Rachel with Patterns and Pixels Canada, and on today's episode, I will finally be sewing together my half square triangle baby quilt. I think I've finally decided on the pattern I'm going to be using for this quilt. I had already played around with it a little bit when I was at the sewing retreat a few weeks ago. And if you haven't seen the video of me preparing for that retreat and also what I completed over the course of the retreat, I'll include the links for both of those below. What I wanted to do though, once I was back home, is to take a little bit more time to try a few different patterns that you saw previously and just take that time, more calm environment to look at the patterns and decide, or the designs rather, and decide which one I wanted to use for this particular quilt. It was a lot of fun going to the sewing retreat and working on it there, but I was sharing the display board with a room full of other quilters. Here, this board is just mine and my mom's, but I always get to it first. And I was able to leave the quilts up for a little bit longer while I decided which pattern I wanted to use. One of the reasons why I enjoy using half square triangles so much is because the pattern options are absolutely endless. For this particular quilt, I kept in mind the fabric that I had chosen, but also the person that I'm intending to give this quilt to. And I think that this pattern suits both of those needs perfectly. Now that I've decided on the pattern I'm going to use, I'm going to spend some time tweaking it. First of all, if I just direct your eyes down there, it looks as though I'm missing two squares, two blocks. And I'm not. I was just throwing up the blocks that I had made onto my display board until I had a pattern that I liked. Now that I've figured it out, what the pattern is that I'd like to use, I can fix the sizing of it. I have 128 blocks. So I'm going to adjust my quilt size so that way it's 8 blocks by 16, and that way I get to my 128. The other thing that I'm going to be adjusting are the actual blocks themselves. If I can just show you a little bit closer, I've got some blocks here that are the same, and on this side as well. And I don't want to have that. I'm going to move them around so that way none of the grays that are the same and none of the oranges that are the same are touching one another. And I've also noticed, and it wasn't until I took a picture of this, that some of my oranges come across, and actually some of the grays, now that I look at it, come across a bit darker than the other ones. So I want to make sure there's a nice balance across the quilt before I stitch all the pieces together. I've sewn all the rows together. I checked all the blocks to make sure that they were positioned in a way that I liked and I didn't have any duplicate fabrics touching one another. And I did make one change from what I said earlier in the video. I decided, there we go, just to show you the top, I decided that I was going to go with a 9 by 14 block arrangement on this quilt. I did try, what did I say before? 8 by 16, I think. And it was too skinny. It was too narrow. It was almost turning into like a table runner rather than a baby quilt. So what I've got done here now is all the blocks in each row have been sewn together. Ooh, here you go. And then my job for today is to sew all of these rows to one another. So the width of the quilt right now is what is going to stay the same. I'll find the measurements for that later. The height might change a little bit. If I stand back, there we go. The height might change a little bit once I get all the rows sewn together in my seam allowances. And we'll find out what the final measurement is once I have that job done. All right, I am halfway through the quilt top. And as you saw earlier, Salsa's being very helpful today. It's cold and wet today, and she doesn't want to go outside, and she wants cuddles and doesn't understand that I'm busy. Go down here for 2 minutes, then we can cuddle. So I finished sewing together 7 of my 14 rows. And as you've noticed in the video, as I've been sewing, I've been alternating which way I'm stitching so that way I don't end up with a slight curve as I go along. I have also been ironing the long rows open, whereas the individual blocks that I did, the rows that I sewed those seams in opposite directions so that way they would nest when I came to sew my rows together. For the most part, it has worked quite well. What I have discovered as I was working is that sometimes something pulls or slips as it goes through the machine. I've tried to counteract that by using as many pins as humanly possible to try and keep things together. But because I have such contrasting colors, it really, really shows if I don't have my points lining up perfectly, which means on a lot of these rows, probably maybe 5 of the 7 that I've sewn so far, there have been small sections that I have unpicked and restitched. On this quilt, on the charm quilt, you wouldn't notice if I was off a little bit. On this one, it really shows if my points don't line up perfectly. All that means is that it has taken me a lot longer to sew just half the quilt than I had anticipated. Just fun. I have 7 more rows to go before I'm finished, but I think I'll be pausing now just slightly to give Salsa some cuddles because she is clearly in desperate need of that. And then I will finish sewing the rest of the quilt a little later on. This is the whole quilt top finally sewn together. And I think the fluke of the first 7 where I had to keep adjusting the seams to get my points to match up must have just been, I don't know, a fluke. I didn't have to do any adjusting for the final 7 rows that I sewed on. I was very careful with the pins, went very slowly, but everything lined up perfectly. So maybe I just needed to find my rhythm with the first 7 rows. My next step now is to give the whole quilt just a quick press, check things over, find little stray threads. Then I'm going to put it back up on the display board and give it a measure to see what size I have ended up with. There is the quilt top all finished. I have recently learned that when you have a quilt top that is pieced together, but not yet quilted, it's called a flimsy, which makes sense because it's a bit flimsy right now. So my baby quilt flimsy is finished. It measured in at 38.5 inches by 59.5, which I think is just fine for my purposes. I did end up with 2 leftover blocks, or orphan blocks as they're called. I don't like having leftover blocks because that to me means there's still something else I have to get done. Normally I would sew those to the back when I go to quilt my piece. However, because I'm planning on using a flannel or a fleece or a minky, something soft on the back of this, I don't know whether or not sewing on 2 cotton squares is really going to work. So I've got a few ideas as to what I might use these blocks for. We'll see. You may or may not end up seeing those creations. So this is the quilt's finished. I don't have the backing fabric yet because I wasn't too sure what size I was going to end up with. So some point soon, I'm going to go shopping. I'm going to take this with me, and I'm going to take the Charm Quilt Flimsy with me as well, and select the backing fabric that I would like to use for both of those quilts, and then I will get them quilted together. If you have enjoyed watching me create this quilt and would like to see other work that I've done, remember to hit that like, subscribe, and bell notification to let me know to keep making more videos. Bye!